Good evening. Welcome to The Pipeline. This is the Western Standard's weekly news panel where we cover top stories or interesting stories, or at least discussion-worthy stories among a few of us here every week. Typically, our publisher, Derek Fildebrand, hosts this show. He's unavailable today, so you've got me, and I'm Alberta columnist Cory Morgan with the Western Standard. I'm usually on. I'm just usually a couple of seats over. And as well, we have our opinion editor, as always, Nigel Hannaford. How you doing, Nigel?
So far, so good, Cory.
Okay, well, we'll see if we can't change that over
the
course of the show.
There's plenty of time to screw it up.
There certainly is, and we have a knack for it. And bringing in our only occasional show appearance, so if anybody's going to mess it up, it could very well be him, our intrepid Calgary reporter, Jonathan Bradley. Hey, Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Happy to be back.
Great, thanks. So we've got a lot to cover today, and as I was just kind of wanted to talk about quickly earlier, you went down and checked out some of the picket lines in Calgary here at the public service strike going on.
Yes, it was outside the Harry Hayes building. There were about 1,200 people who showed up. People were protesting with signs such as on strike or 2% is for milk, referencing the 2% wage increase that they want. And yeah.
Or I would
think they want more than 2%.
They want more like 30 to 40%.
Yes.
Yes, well, they get creative with their signs. If only they'd put as much effort into their time in the office. Yes. But, well, I'm glad you came down there and back safely. Sometimes those picket lines can get a little hairy, and it's a sizable turnout. You can't deny that.
I didn't see anyone famous, but apparently Gil McGowan was down there, and I'm sure that if he was to see me and I was to interview him, he'd probably go on some unhinged rant.
Well,
I say it was a large turnout, but I don't think they had much choice in the matter. If you're a union member, you've got to be out on the picket line, right?
Yes, there's the irony of it. If you want your strike pay, you've actually got to get up and go out and show up for it. Versus, though, if you're still working for the government, you can keep your fuzzy bunny slippers on and work from home for the most part.
I thought that's part of what the strike was about, along with the with the crazy wage raise.
Yes.
Just the ironies of life.
Yes, we'll see
over them every day
how it develops, and as with Gil and as with and they'll segue in, and we'll talk about that in a moment with some of the I guess progressive reaction to some of the Western Standard and other news outlets with our coverage and access to them. Just that reminder before we get into the subjects. Then this is the Western Standard's weekly show. These stories, if you want to see them in full and in detail, you got to go to the westernstandard.news. It's a subscription-based thing. That's how we can stay independent from government funding and keep getting these stories to you and being accountable to you. Get on there. It's $9.99 a month, $99 a year. Well worth it. It's like a newspaper subscription. That way we can keep having these reporters we're sending out and columnists and others to carry on and do this work and get this content to you. So again, and to those who've already subscribed, of course, thank you all very much. So yes, let's talk about press freedom over this week. It was interesting. Nigel, you don't typically go to press conferences, but in this case, you went to see former Premier Notley's press conference here in Calgary and put forth a question to her that got quite a response.
I did indeed. For some time, Cory, and as you know, the Western Standard has been cut off from receiving press releases and communiques from the NDP. It's an odd situation. We get them from the Saskatchewan NDP. I'm very grateful to have that. We get them from the federal party. We're an accredited news media in the Alberta legislature and the Saskatchewan legislature. We're an accredited even to the press gallery in Ottawa. But the NDP here in Alberta takes the view that we're not a real newspaper. And on the day that I went down there, my question, and I imagine quite a few of our viewers have probably seen this already because the video has been widely viewed. But the question was simply, why are you cutting us off from the source of information? Obviously, we're not a particularly NDP-friendly newspaper, but we still cover the NDP. And so the answer was that, we were not a very nice organization. We were kind of hateful, actually, and therefore they simply weren't going to take any questions from us. So we have here a political party, a leader of a political party who is saying, well, look, we'll pick and choose who we take questions from. Now, you'd never get away with that with the Calgary Herald or the National Post or the Edmonton Journal. But with online media, I guess the leader of the opposition has decided it's worth a try. Just don't talk to these people. And I think it's presumptuous to say, well, this organization is okay and this one is not, when all organizations we're talking about are accredited news media, fit the bill. The only way that this publication differs from the Calgary Herald or the Edmonton Journal is that we do not receive the federal subsidy. Maybe that's what you have to do to be considered, but we don't want to be considered state-run media either. So that's what we do. We refuse the subsidies. That's what happened.
Well, that's a distinction we pride ourselves.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Jonathan, you've been assigned to cover some NDP events or things like that, I believe, in the past. Did you have issues with them before? Or?
On a handful of occasions, I have covered like NDP-related stories. I remember one time I wanted to cover the Alberta NDP convention, but they didn't let me in. Part of that problem was because I didn't accredit myself fast enough in time, and I didn't know in advance, so that was my issue. But I kind of felt that since I wasn't accredited to that event, I'm like, oh, I wonder if they would have treated me different if, I was like CBC or CTV and, more friendly to them.
Yeah, I suspect they might make accommodations if it were an outlet there.
Oh, of course.
Inclined to see coverage. But, I mean, yes, we aren't a friend of the NDP. Typically, I guess, editorially, but it's not like we write anything that's untrue or anything like that. We're just a conservative leading paper.
Yeah.
But they aren't making us, we're not going to be any more friendly to them in light of this sort of action back at us.
Well, right before an election, it did seem a strange thing to do. But there's actually one other aspect to this, and that is that a few days before this press release, Premier Smith had indicated that she was only going to take one question at these press conferences. There would be no follow-up. And leaving aside the fact that there is room for a discussion on whether that is actually a good thing to do or not. I mean, if you're the last guy to ask a question at some of these press conferences where people go on with their follow-ups, you may not get to ask your question. And Smith's statement was she wanted to make sure that without going to great long lengths, that everybody got to ask their question. You can have that discussion. However, it was played as a bad story for Premier Smith. And indeed, the Alberta Press Gallery wrote to her and asked her to reconsider. So I think that what was going on Monday was that Rachel Notley, as you would expect, wanted to make some hay out of the embarrassment of her rival, and said, "Oh, I'll take questions. I'll take as many questions as you want." I was first to the mic.
As luck would have it.
As luck would have it, and made my pitch. And that was when she told me that she wouldn't take questions from the Western Standard because we were horrible people and not a real newspaper. So that's kind of the whole story right there. And
she didn't have you removed, at least. I saw some video. I think it was Cian Bexty was actually removed from the conference, and I think they also turned away Rebel News.
That's exactly right. Yes, Bexty was, come with me, sir. And with the Rebel News chap, Herb Dallowell, I think his name was. Just
Alex Dallowell.
Alex, was it? Where did I get Herb from? Must be a Liberal politician.
Yeah.
Anyway, Mr. Dallowell was just told he couldn't go in, and off he went.
It's it's a trend I think is distressing though in general. I mean, some of the reason, whether with Premier Smith, for example, I mean, follow-ups are important. I know they can drag out a conference. We have some reporters I know do a 5-minute preamble before they can get a question out of them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I like to see a leader think on their feet. It's that second question, I think, is the one that makes them think and have to really respond sometimes rather than the first one. And I think in the case of Premier Smith, I know they're saying it's for the sake of brevity, but I suspect maybe it's also just to try and avoid more incidents that can cause unexpected or wanted grief.
Cory, you can speculate on the reasons. Like I said, there's room for a whole discussion on that. But what it came down to for me that day is with Premier Smith, I would have got one question. I didn't get any.
It's one more than you got with Premier Notley.
Well, one other point to consider that I think the NDP is kind of annoyed with is that we've been covering some of the opposition research on various candidates. Like we've done a few stories about the Alberta NDP candidate for Calgary Elbow, Samir Kayande, who's made some questionable comments about oil and gas, we'll put it that way. And those stories often do well on our site. And I think that's part of the issue on why they're not talking to us.
Yeah, and I think it's a bit of the way things have evolved now too. I mean, there's always been biased press. Every publication's always had this leaning or that leaning. It was the paper publications, but politicians seem to accept that. You just had to deal with it. You knew this guy was going to be a little more hostile and that one was going to be a little more friendly. But south of the border and federally with Polyev, I mean, some of the outright clashes with media right now are really starting to come to a head.
Well, let's face it, Cory. I mean, we have our differences with all political parties. You were mentioning some questionable comments by NDP candidates.
Yes.
Well, we have one. The NDP has a couple of candidates who made outrageous anti-police statements. They've actually tweeted these things out.
Yes.
And of course, the tweets have been deleted, but they're out there if you know where to look. Accusing them of being, I think they must be wife beaters. There's a lot of sick rage goes home.
That was Drew Farrell from Calgary Bow.
So it was, and Drew Farrell was standing right there with Rachel Notley on Monday. Well, on this, so far from repudiating these kinds of scurrilous, outrageous comments, Rachel Notley evidently just sucks it up and carries on. There's a list of them. We'll probably be. We ran one of your stories, I believe it was last week, that had 3 or 4 of them.
Yes, that was the one about the 6 candidates.
So, if you, for example, don't care for NDP support for that practice of suggesting to children that they may not be the sex they were born with, and support a policy of bringing children to counselors without the knowledge of their parents, maybe even to a medical service without the knowledge of their parents, young children, 9, 10, 12, 13. We're against that. We believe children and parents are the fundamental unit. And if there's anything going on with the kid, the parent needs to be the first to know, not the last. And I think there are some members of some candidates who are running for the NDP who would disagree with that position. Well, if that's the case, we are going to attract some controversy. And glad to do it, frankly.
Cover every side. Well, we'll keep pushing on. It's not like we're going to stop covering them just because they don't care for our presence there. So we'll pivot a little and get on to the legacy media. And actually, before I start on that, I mean, I'll carry on with this a little bit more. Normally, when a politician, though, gets hostile with media members, the press gallery and the core tend to circle the wagons, even if they don't necessarily like. But in this case, I'm not seeing a lot out of the provincial press gallery popping out and saying, hey, Madam Notley, this isn't necessarily all that.
I don't know whether the last word on that is written yet, but I will tell you, I was very good. And actually, Derek made reference to this in his column on the matter on Tuesday. CTV reporter there at the time was Jordan Callaghan. Just followed up. Asked Rachel Notley again how she felt about whether she should be picking and choosing between news outlets when she was writing. So I had some support there, and I noticed there has been a couple of favorable comments in the Calgary Herald that Rick Bell, or in the Sun, Rick Bell had made reference to it, and so I don't get the impression that the news media are so opposed to us, or they maybe actually be supportive.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that's columnist by columnist or writer.
Yeah,
but it's not universally indifferent to what she's doing.
I mean, it'll be interesting to see whether the Alberta Press Gallery has anything to say.
Because it's just such a bad precedent in general.
Yeah.
I mean, again, presumably, if you get a new premier in there, the same premier, she might start pulling such tactics down the road as well. You don't want to set that selective ability to pick who you're going to answer.
I mean, this is the thing. These are these little illustrative moments when you think, well, okay, if you did have the NDP led by Rachel Notley as another government, what would it be like? Well, I guess it would be like that. And I guess that the kind of comments that Jonathan was referring to earlier would continue to be acceptable from members of government. It's something that it's really something to be concerned about, frankly. I hope people are paying attention to it.
Certainly do. So let's get on to the big monolithic media institution in Canada, Mother Corp, the CBC. And over the weekend, we had quite an interesting episode with Elon Musk basically poking a finger in the eye of the CBC and changing, for people who aren't familiar with Twitter, there's identification, verification badges. You know, there's blue ones for a general verification, and there's a golden one they give to government-funded media. It's a special one that goes towards them. And Musk decided to change the CBCs to government-funded, which kind of only makes sense. They are government funded.
$1.2 billion of taxpayers' money every year.
I believe it was 1.4, wasn't it?
No, well,
perhaps they
you
cut
made
it
it
one
right.
year. I don't know. A lot of money.
There's a little bit of advertising revenue
Yes.
too.
Yeah, and just to lay it out more for the viewers before we dissect a little what happened there, you know, they went bananas, and progressives went bananas, and people went off, and they said it's unfair, and they make some advertising revenue. Said, okay, that's fine. Well, we'll change the label, say 70% tax funded. And they were still upset, so he said, fine, 69. And that's where it's still sitting today. But I know it's kind of petty, and I know it's a minor thing, but at the same time, boy, with the amount of outrage being expressed, even Prime Minister Trudeau addressed this. Like Jonathan, have you covered and watched this, and what do you think what's going on with this?
Well, I think it's hilarious how Elon Musk continues to treat Twitter like his own personal playground, just doing whatever he wants without people like dictating to him what to say. I thought it was hilarious when he changed it to the 70% government funded, because none of the other government funded media outlets have a percentage listed.
Yeah, he's definitely given them unique treatment. Nigel, I mean, would you think it's unfair to label them as a government funded outlet? Or
Well, not really. They are.
yes,
You know, I mean, the distinction, I think what people are doing here is that they're hearing government funded and understanding government directed. Now, I don't think that the CBC gets a weekly phone call from the Prime Minister's office telling them what they need to write about and what the line is this week. I mean, in the crazy world we live in, anything is possible, but I don't think that actually
they're not
happens.
a full state broadcaster.
So, in other words, they're not like Al Ahram or Pravda, where the control is very, very tight. So it's the one thing, though, is that you don't get to be at the top of the CBC if you're likely to go off message anyway. These folks don't need to be told what is, favorable to the government and what is not favorable to the government. And sometimes, to their credit, they do bring up a story. They bring up one just this last week, which was something that the Liberals would probably prefer not to have had come up. But they have a certain culture, and that culture is generally supportive of left-wing, progressive, liberal causes. So they don't really need to be instructed on what the line is.
No, I mean, they aren't government directly controlled, but they're most certainly influenced and holding a similar ideology, anyways, to the current government as it sits.
Yeah, that's right. So I don't think it's a pointless discussion, though. It does help to. I think it helps for people to be reminded that, actually, the CBC is paid for by public funds.
That reminder, because people, I think, are starting to kind of question, well, do we really need to keep funding this thing? Because not many people watch it anymore.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that's true. And then and the other thing is that it would have strengthened the CBC's case if it had been the CBC that had led the way with the disclosures on the Chinese allegations of Chinese electoral interference. So I would expect in their defense they would say, well, the guys from CSIS didn't come to us. Well, why didn't they come to you?
Yeah.
You know,
that's a good point. I mean, they wanted to pick wherever they thought somebody's going to give it good, clear coverage, and that turned out to be the Globe and Mail.
And later Global TV. So yeah, that tells you something. Look, so often we pick on the CBC, and we do so with good reason. But I want to acknowledge that there are some reporters in the CBC who are very well trained and are very well motivated.
Yes.
And do a really good job. So I'm not going to name names, but this is not a totally lost cause.
No, and then
it is government funded. So let's not pretend it isn't.
Well, that's it. And people of an older vintage like yourselves, I mean, some of the best investigative stuff you used to see a long time ago very often was coming from the CBC. I mean, because they had the budget, they had the ability, they would dig into things that a lot of outlets didn't and really get there. But Jonathan, you didn't grow up with that from the CBC so much as we did.
Well, when I was younger, I remember that it was much different compared to now. I mean, I'm 24 right now, but in the last few years on Twitter in particular, you'll see some story that they do, and then people just jump on it. Like I remember a few years ago, there was a story about, I think it was the 16 words you shouldn't say. It was things like blacklist, blackmail.
Yeah, that's right.
Brainstorm. And it was just like, why are we spending money on this?
Yeah. That
They've drifted down some strange roads of woke. I mean, that's part of the problem that you have, I think, when you're not accountable to viewers. You stop caring actually about what your viewers necessarily want to see.
Yes, and that was a big part of why former CBC producer Tara Henley left. I got to see Tara speak at the Canada Geography Network National Conference, and she spoke about how that's a problem with much of the mainstream media nowadays, on how they're just trying to, appease this woke mob with these niche stories that, regular people wouldn't care about.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they've been appropriately labeled. I suspect Mr. Musk isn't going to be all that eager to change it back, no matter how much they stamp their little feet and complain about it. So I guess they must well just accept it and carry on as a state-funded broadcaster.
Yeah. Jonathan told me the other day that some of his best friends work for the CBC. So
no, not at all.
It's always that line, isn't there? All right. Well, let's get a little closer into Alberta. Something it still impacts everything right across the country. Everybody's grappling with this. I've been writing about these issues as well. Premier Daniel Smith's government has actually talked a little bit about, or at least mused about, bringing in something that might mandate treatment for addicts, or basically perhaps short-term incarceration of some sort to force a treatment upon somebody when they've hit a certain degree as an addict. And of course, it's caused a lot of controversy immediately. Jonathan, you've been reading up on that and watching the situation?
Yes, so they're looking at introducing a bill about involuntary drug treatment. So what that would entail is if people are arrested, they would be required to do this treatment to avoid criminal penalties, sanctions, things like that. It's much different compared to now where, we'll have like an addict and, maybe the police officer will take the drugs away or maybe arrest them if they're being violent. But this would could incentivize people to, get clean and yeah.
And Nigel, I mean, it's a big line to cross to take somebody's liberty, even if for their own good. I mean, we've seen a lot of times where the state says they're doing something for your own good, and quite often it's anything but.
Well, that certainly is always the difficulty, isn't it? And I think the original argument for closing the institutions, this is going back 30 years now, but there was a time when people who were either addicted or had serious mental illness problems would end up in a home, in a supervised group environment. And I don't imagine those are always pleasant places. So the argument was that, well, you take away their agency, there's a better way of doing this. We can sort of have people live in halfway houses and have the supervised medication and so forth and so on. Well, it didn't work, did it? So I mean, I guess, when do you intervene if somebody appears to be indulging in self-harmful practices? If you were walking down the street and you saw somebody banging himself on the head with a piece of wood, you would probably get something done about it. You would call the police, you'd call the why? Well, I mean, he's going to kill himself, all right? So you intervene. Clearly not in his right mind, the way that you would intervene in the case of a child about to do something dangerous, where they don't have the judgment to know that what they're doing. You're expected to intervene. So now you come to somebody who is, well, they've taken, it's a cold night, they've OD'd, they're laying there on a park bench, they're going to die. So do you scoop them up from the park bench and take them to a place of shelter? Yes. And I don't think anybody would object to that. Do you then, when you see that pattern of behavior repeated, do you eventually say, we need to do something to help this person get past whatever it is that causes them to this self-destructive behavior every night? I mean, that's before we even get into the larger argument of what is the effect on the rest of society when you have a large group of people making it difficult for everybody else to do what they normally do. The difficulties we've heard on the sea trains. I was just driving home the other day, and I saw somebody already set up their camp in a doorway. I used to live down in the Beltline, and some of the stuff you saw that went on down there, if you were a shopkeeper, the first thing you had to do was to scrub down your doorstep. I don't want to get too explicit here. You know what I'm talking about. Why should people have to put up with that? That is another argument. That's not a sympathetic one. People say, well, you know, we've got to make accommodations for people who struggle. Well, all right. When exactly are you prepared to step in and say, this person needs help? If they don't get it, they're going to kill themselves. Yep. What we're talking about is when they are apprehended for something else, then they have that choice. It's still a choice.
Yes, a choice perhaps between, yes, a full incarceration or entering a treatment program. And I mean, we've seen, I think that's why even, you know, governments are finally musing about it. The enablement approach has failed. It's failed everywhere it's been tried. The West Coast is a disaster from Los Angeles all the way up to Vancouver. Anywhere where they try saying, if we can just give enough safe consumption, administer naloxone enough times, they're going to come out of their fog and voluntarily go into treatment, and they don't, and they won't. The other aspect of this too, though, I mean, as Rachel Notley was, of course, playing the politics, saying Danielle Smith wants to incarcerate innocent Albertans and such, but I believe I saw that it wouldn't be arbitrary. They would set up a tribunal, and I would imagine set some bars. Has this person, I'm just throwing things out, you know, been repeatedly brought in for this? Has there been medical distress? Have they perhaps threatened others' safety or the well-being of businesses? I mean, a number of check boxes before you get to the point of forcing the issue.
Yeah. And one point that I want to build on is with Alberta, they're doing the Alberta model, whereas BC has the BC model, and the Alberta model is more focused on treatment, whereas the BC model is more focused on harm reduction. I know for a fact that Danielle Smith's current chief of staff, Marshall Smith, used to be a former drug addict in the downtown east side of Vancouver. And he talked about how eventually it was a treatment model like what's going on in Alberta, which ultimately brought him out of the addiction and, you know, treated him.
Yeah, I mean, they need treatment. They won't come out alone. You can't just cold turkey it. You can't white knuckle it. And I mean, it's great for the people who've never experienced withdrawal. You know, they can't understand. And again, I've been open about it. I had to deal with my alcoholism. I had to go to a lot of AA meetings and deal with a lot of things to get there. And I had a lot of help. One of the aspects of that is to be able to get around other people who have experienced that, so you can share your experiences and what works, and you network. But you've got to get into that program, that first step, and to try and think that some of those addicts, when they're at the point of sleeping behind a dumpster, unconscious, or they're shuffling down the street again, you know, emaciated and covered in sores, they're not going to voluntarily choose to come in at that point. And we're looking at intervention to save a life by that point. They're not going to make it if we leave them as it is. But that's what we're being asked to do. And,
Yeah, it's, you know, I guess politics is the art of negotiating between very difficult options. If it was easy, anybody could do it. This is a tough one.
Yes.
yeah, and I mean, I remember initially when Jonathan came here, it's been a while since he got out here. And
Yeah, it's moved out here in July.
And you hadn't seen much of it initially, and you were wondering what we were talking about in here. It's not so bad, but once you kind of get down and get a closer look, you realize, and you've probably seen it, I imagine, escalate in this last 8
Oh,
months.
of course. I've had to intervene on 3 occasions with people who are having a bad reaction to drugs. One of them was actually, I want to say maybe 3 weeks ago, where I was shopping at the superstore in the downtown East Village, and there was a guy there who looks like he was overdosing, and I had to call the ambulance over that. And the response, what I always remember was the response from a paramedic. The paramedic basically walked up to the guy who was at that time woken up, and he's like, "Oh, are you fine?" He's like, "Yeah." And then I think he asked him a few other questions. He's like, "Okay, we're good. We're out of here." I'm like, "Excuse me, that was less than a minute you were here. Like, maybe you should have tried to encourage the guy to go into treatment or something."
They don't have more that they can do, and they only have so
Oh,
much
of course.
time. It's tough, and I mean, just to kind of finish on that subject, I just know that people are coming at this with this intervention not from a place without compassion. That's where it's coming from. Like, try to put yourselves in the shoes of the family members of these addicts. They are people. We don't want to dehumanize them. They came from somewhere. They've probably got loved ones somewhere, and I can only imagine most of those loved ones would be fine if that's what it takes. If you've got to take them and put them in treatment, because it's still a much better fate than dying in an alley and or in a park somewhere. It's awful.
Good for you, Jonathan, for doing something and not looking the other way.
Thank you. Yep.
It's part of it. The blinders that are starting to come on to people.
It can be scary too. Like even last week, as I was grocery shopping, there was a guy who looked like he was having a bad reaction in one of the alleyways. And as I was walking by, I just went up to him. I obviously cut my distance because like sometimes it can snap. And I was like, do you need an ambulance? And he was just kind of like incoherent. And I was like, I'm like, are you sure you don't want an ambulance? And he just like dismissed me. I'm like, okay. I'm like, at least I offered help, but like, it's up to you sometimes to make the choice.
It's hard. And then, I mean, I used to carry naloxone. I wrote a column a couple of years ago. I got that Western Standard Award for that one. It was a hard one to write. Yeah. And I was walking into here, and I went through a park, and I encountered an overdose, and that didn't end well. The naloxone didn't work, and a young man died in front of me.
Yeah.
It shook me up. I'm still.
You carry some in the car too, by the way.
Shaking. And I carry it because I'm driving all over the place with Uber. But you got to try and intervene. But I mean, I've had first responders on my show on that too. Say, we see the same person sometimes day after day after day. It's not to say they should stop intervening, but we got to break that pattern. I mean, one of these times it's not going to work. So challenging, but as Nigel said, if there were easy answers, somebody would have found them already.
Yeah, you bet.
But we keep trying. I'm just happy to see some people with courage, at least, to shake the status quo up a little and propose some different things. So speaking, then we will go into something a little less grave and speaking of the status quo, though. So the whole Dylan Mulvaney Bud Light debacle. That's the only term I can use for it. Where do we begin here?
Oh my goodness.
Jonathan, I'll start with the young guy anyways. You're more familiar with social media influencers, and they influence. It's a relative new trend in the last few years. They carry a lot of weight, people that come out of nowhere, and some large brands are starting to utilize them, but I don't know if they're necessarily picking the right winners and losers.
Yes, especially with the Dylan Mulvaney case. And for anyone who's unfamiliar with Dylan Mulvaney, he's a former musical theater star. He was in the Book of Mormon and a few other musicals. And then about a year ago, he decided to transition to a woman, and he's been doing these videos, days of womanhood. So it's like, here's my first day as a woman. Here's my 72nd day as a woman. And Bud Light decided to do this initiative because it was his 1-year anniversary of becoming a woman. So in the ad, it's him walking up with all these beer cans, and then he puts them down and starts talking about March Madness and Bud Light and how it's a great brand. But obviously, with Bud Light, you would associate their drinkers, to be more, conservative white guys who probably aren't too fond of Dylan Mulvaney. And it's led to their stocks dropping a ton, and people have stopped buying it as much. And
Well, a ton. $6 billion.
Yeah, that's a ton.
That's a ton.
It's a big thing. And I mean, I understand wanting to broaden your market. You want to reach out and bring in new consumers. Absolutely. But if you're going to sacrifice a large core of your existing consumers to get it, it's probably not a wise business decision. Who came up with this?
Well, actually, it's possible to name names, and we have. There is a person in the sort of the mid-level marketing department in Anheuser-Busch, which is the parent company for Bud Light, who did a Twitter interview, not a Twitter interview, an interview that ended up on Twitter. And she said, "Well, this was our thinking. We're trying to, we got a bunch of good old boys, it's kind of NASCAR type of a crowd, as though there was something mildly reprehensible about NASCAR, and we just wanted to reach a younger, hipper, cooler crowd. But the thing is, for all the publicity that the trans movement gets, I don't get the impression, just walking up and down the street and hanging out in the places I go to and where I do run into young people, that it's actually a mainstream preoccupation in the demographic that Dylan Mulvaney would, most of them are tolerant of it, but I don't see too many imitators. So perhaps this just wasn't the thing to do.
Did they gain outside of that? We know it lost. I mean, when I drank, I didn't care. I'm going for whatever tastes okay and is cheapest when I was really at my height. But brand loyalty is very serious when it comes to beers. There's some people. I'm a Bud Light guy. I'm a Coors Light guy. I'm a Sleeman's, whatever it may be. And it's difficult to budge people from those brands. But I mean, it's hard to bring new ones in. But boy, it's dangerous to knock them off of it, because it's not a big leap for that NASCAR crowd to start drinking Coors Light.
Well, that's right. What they really said was, this Bud's not for you. So, I hate to get serious on these shows, but Cory, indulge me for a moment. Last year, a whole bunch of people who were habitually not listened to and whose views by and large are dismissed by the elite establishment that runs this country got into their semi-trailers and drove to Ottawa. Remember that film, Network, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore? And they went to Ottawa and they said, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. And it wasn't too long after that the Conservative Party had an election for a new leader. And I think that Pierre Poilievre benefited considerably from that sentiment, that he was authentic. He wasn't saying the same tired old stuff that the others were saying. And a whole bunch, he had such an overwhelming 72% acceptance within the party. And people were saying, I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take the old stuff anymore. And now you have this one. And obviously, a whole demographic said, if that's what you think is cool, I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to drink your beer anymore.
Yeah.
And they'll come back, okay? More Clydesdale ads will do it in the end, but eventually they'll come back. But I find it very interesting that you get these mass reactions in this last few years. Is it COVID? Maybe, I don't know.
Hypersensitive but I mean, upset. But I mean, people are tired of just having it. The term is so much pushed down your throat. It's easy to ignore, but it is everywhere, and it's getting ubiquitous, and we're getting tired of it. As you said, mad as hell. I just don't want any more of it. That's all. I don't have a problem with it. I mean, bizarrely, with this influencer, she got sponsored by Tampax. I wish I was kidding. Now, when we get to the point of some of this trans trend, and I'm going to call it a trend, there's real trans people, I think, who transitioned and they want to live a life as a different gender, and good on them. But a lot of them, it just seems to be a fad. And this is when it comes to the point, in my view, of being a mockery of biological women. When you have a person who never, unless they had a nosebleed that they wanted to stop up, is going to conceivably need a Tampax yet actually get sponsored by them. It's a departure from physiological reality that we're being not asked, but demanded that we accept. And I think, as you said, people are finally saying, that's enough. Just let me have a beer around a fire and have some fun without thinking about this odd person.
It's like Kid Rock said at the end of his video, stop it.
I saw, there was a tweet, I can't remember who I saw it from. I think it was from a Carrie Lake's account, and apparently she was at some event and there was an open bar, and she said all the beers have been taken except for Bud Light, which was funny because it was like, oh my God, like people are really worked up about this commercial.
Well, yeah, and I mean, again, you shouldn't care so much, but I mean, that's the reality of marketing, and that's the way those things, particularly beers. I mean, when you're at that gathering, you can get the poking and the mockery because you're holding that brand right there. I don't imagine that they're suddenly selling a load of Bud Light at Twisted Elements in Calgary. So, I mean, I don't know how much they've gained, and as you said, they'll come back eventually. We're talking about Budweiser. I mean, But it just seems to be such a terrible tack to take.
Actually, the thought I've been playing with is if I were a marketing executive and I had just made an important decision that dropped $6 billion off my company's stock value, what would be my next job?
Oh yeah, I mean it's a measurable move that you've made. In fact, with the marketing change, I mean, and you've got to be careful. I mean, you're too young, Jonathan, but if you remember, they changed Coca-Cola in the 80s.
Oh my word!
And
yes.
some people still haven't gotten over that. I think with the new Coke, I mean, that was a catastrophe, and they took a beating on that. They had to come back with the classic Coke and recover from it. That just some of those big brands, people take them. They stick with them for life, and boy, they get upset when you mess with their brand. And somebody's learned some hard lessons, I think, out there. But, time will tell. Oh, well, I mean, it's their beer. It's their business. I can't boycott them even if I wanted to. I just don't drink the stuff anymore. But I don't think I'd go that far out of my way. I don't really care. But a lot of people do, though. The sales wouldn't drop by that much if it didn't. So we'll see what happens. Well, that about wraps it up this week, guys. Thanks for joining me. We'll be back to our normal panel again next week with a whole bunch more stuff to rant and.
I bet we do.
So
yes. When do you think the RIT is going to drop?
RIT. Typically, it should be May 1st, I guess.
I would say May 1st. Yes. 28-day election campaign.
Campaign.
So we got another 10 days to.
Before it gets stupid. Right?
Before it gets stupid.
There. This has been The Pipeline. We appreciate you tuning in, and we will see you all next week at this time.
Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Without the CSSA, our gun rights would have been taken long ago. These guys are on the front lines helping to draft smart and intelligent firearms regulations and legislation in Canada, and more importantly, educating the public about how we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. If you become a member, it's absolutely worth every penny.
As things are greening up outside, the commodity markets aren't following suit as they're mostly red today. The only thing that is up is cash barley, which is up $3 a ton to $4.22 per metric. And feed wheat's unchanged at $4.20 a metric, and corn is holding steady at $4.15 a metric. Moving to the milling wheat markets, May Minneapolis futures dropped 12.5 cents to $8.73 per bushel, with local hard red spring bid for April movement at $10.25 per bushel delivered. In the oilseeds, nearby canola futures are off $4.80 to $777 per metric ton, with delivered values for April-May movement at $17.50 per bushel. Continuing on to the pulse markets, nearby red lentil prices are trading at 35 cents per pound, and yellow peas remain at $12 per bushel. Finishing up with the cattle markets, June live cattle dropped 1.78 cents to 163.43 per hundredweight. For more information on pricing and picked up on farm options, give me a call at 403-394-1711. I'm Mike Van Dyke at Marketplace Commodities, accurate real-time marketing information and pricing options.
You can become a Western Standard member for just $10 a month or $99 a year for unlimited access